Good day. Today is February 13th, 2025, and as I make this program, we find ourselves perhaps in a different world from the one that existed 24 hours earlier. I say that though everything is still in flux, and we cannot ever be sure that things will turn out exactly as we expect. But anyway, there is no doubt that the events of the last 24 hours have been dramatic, and quite plausibly they have been momentous as well. In fact, one is reminded of that quote, which is sometimes attributed to Lenin, though I've never been able to find any actual citation that conclusively proves that it was ever said by Lenin, which is that there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. Well, the last couple of weeks since Donald Trump was inaugurated certainly seems to fit that description, and the last 24 hours fits that description as well. If I can just make one small personal observation, and it is a very small observation. Yesterday, I spent a lot of time, as I always do, putting together a video, and of course it was published, and as soon as it was published, within basically 30 minutes, 40 minutes, it became completely outdated because the news of the conversation between Putin and Trump started to seep through. I say that, I discussed at some length in yesterday's program the prospect of negotiations between the United States and Russia, why negotiations between these two countries might be appealing to each, and how negotiations could take place, and what the outcome of those negotiations might be. And I think, looking at it objectively, what appears to be happening is not so very different from some of the things I discussed in yesterday's video and in earlier programs. Nonetheless, I won't deny it was a bit startling to see the video go up and then to learn that all of the events of yesterday were taking place. Now, before I do discuss those events, and in particular the Putin-Trump call and the reactions to it and the events that are likely to follow from it, there is something else I do want to say, and it is important, and I want to get it out first because obviously most of the program is going to be devoted to the aftermath of the Putin-Trump call and to the call itself, and anything else I say is going to be submerged in that discussion. So yesterday, amongst the many other things that took place, was confirmation that Tulsi Gabbard has been confirmed by the Senate and has been appointed Director of National Intelligence. Now, this is an unequivocally good thing, in my opinion. I don't agree with Tulsi Gabbard about everything, and I have particular differences with her about policies towards the Middle East and towards the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. But overall, I have to say, I think she's been one of the most courageous personalities in American politics over the last 10 years. I think she was appallingly badly treated by her former party, the Democratic Party. I think she's an excellent pick for Director of National Intelligence, and I am delighted that she has been confirmed by the Senate as Director of National Intelligence. I would also very quickly say that it was very interesting to see that the entire Republican Party in the Senate voted for her, except for the now isolated figure of Mitch McConnell, the only Republican senator to vote against her confirmation. Nothing perhaps illustrates the incredible decline in influence of Mitch McConnell than his total isolation yesterday, as he was the only Republican senator to vote against Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation. I have to say that, as far as I am concerned, is also good news. McConnell has been a major force of obstruction in American politics for a very long time, but it is still a startling thing to see. This man who used to have wield so much power in American politics reduced to angry, bitter isolation, as we saw yesterday. But anyway, coming back to Tulsi Gabbard, I'm going to make a suggestion to her. This is a piece of absolutely unsolicited and free advice. I think that as Director of National Intelligence, she's going to need to get some help and advice so as to get herself properly prepared for this task. I would suggest that she contact the people at VIPS, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, in my opinion, one of the best institutions in the United States. I will declare an interest here. I know and consider myself friends with two of the prominent people within VIPS, Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson. I cannot think of any better place for a Director of National Intelligence to get advice. Tulsi herself is a veteran of the US Army. We see how US Army and military veterans altogether have been, in my opinion, a force for rationality in determining US defense priorities. I think intelligence veterans, as united in VIPS, could fulfill the same role. And if you want confirmation that the information, the advice that a future, or rather a present Director of National Intelligence might get from VIPS, well, then I would invite anyone to go and look at the various assessments on intelligence questions that VIPS has been regularly publishing for well over a decade now, and compare the quality of the advice they have been providing with the absolutely wretched and wrong advice that the actual intelligence community has been doing over the same period. So anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this, other than to congratulate Tulsi Gabbard on her confirmation. Let us now turn to the momentous events of yesterday. Now, I think before I do that, before I actually discuss the contents of the Trump-Putin call, about which we are, by the way, surprisingly fully informed, I think a lot needs to be said about what has been going on over the last couple of weeks, because after Trump was inaugurated, well, it was confirmed that his Ukraine peace envoy was going to be General Keith Kellogg. And General Kellogg was coming up with all kinds of ideas about how the process to achieve peace in Ukraine could be taken forward. Everybody in the administration, from Trump down, including Kellogg, agreed that it was in the US interest that the war in Ukraine be brought to an end. But Kellogg clearly had his own ideas. And as I've discussed in program after program, both on this channel and in the various discussions that Alex Christoforou and I have had on the Duran, it was obvious that Kellogg's plan simply wouldn't fly. His various ideas for a freeze, a ceasefire, deployment of European peacekeepers, postponement of NATO entry by 20 years or longer, those sort of plans simply would not fly. And simultaneously with all of these discussions and comments by Kellogg, there have been reports about threats and proposals which clearly seemed to originate from Kellogg and perhaps to some extent from National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, about how the Russians might be either bought or compelled to agree to Kellogg's ideas. There have been threats of all-out economic war against Russia, and there have been proposals that some sanctions be lifted, perhaps all sanctions be lifted, that the Nord Stream pipelines be repaired and be brought back into service, and that sort of thing. And I have repeatedly said that the Russians would almost certainly treat those threats as a bluff and would react badly to them in any event, and that they would not be impressed by the bribes either, because they would have serious doubts about whether the bribes would ever, in the end, be paid. And besides, given that for the Russians, the conflict in Ukraine is a conflict about their long-term security, they were unlikely to compromise on it, on their fundamental interests, simply because they'd been threatened and bribed in the way that Kellogg was apparently proposing to do. And in recent programs, I have discussed how Russian officials, Gazulin, Ryabkov, Nebenzia, others have responded to these threats, how they've dismissed them, how they've clearly called the bluff on the threats, and how they've basically rubbished the bribes. So it was clear that the Kellogg strategy was not working. And anyway, in the meantime, Kellogg was in Europe. He was supposed to unveil his plan at the Munich Security Conference, which, by the way, starts on Friday. But apparently that has been postponed. We now know why. And in the meantime, he was having all sorts of meetings with European officials from the Baltic states. He was going to consult with the Europeans about how to perfect his plan. And I said that he seemed to be falling into the trap that Eve Smith warned against some years ago, and which was recently repeated by George Bieber from the Quincy Institute, and formerly, by the way, from the CIA, in a program we did with him on the Duran, the trap of negotiating proposals with the Europeans in such detail that by the time there had been the actual negotiation with the Russians finally got underway, the plan agreed with the Europeans after painstaking negotiations and discussions was completely out of touch with Russian objectives and was certain to be rejected by them. Eve Smith and George Bieber have warned against this, and it was exactly the pattern of what Kellogg appeared to be about. And one of the most interesting developments also of the last couple of weeks is that various European governments, notably the British, seem to have established contacts with Kellogg, and they were discussing the approach to diplomacy with the Russians that Kellogg was taking. And the British in particular seemed to be very happy with what Kellogg was telling them. And I was reading articles in the Financial Times about how it looked as if Trump was going to take a much harder line against Russia after all, and how the British were broadly satisfied with Kellogg's and Trump's approach. Well, that performance, the Kellogg performance, that play, if you like, continued until yesterday. And then it turned out that, in fact, whatever it was that Kellogg thought he was doing, the real negotiations, the real contacts between the Americans and the Russians were taking place without him. Now, I say that, of course, I don't know exactly what has been discussed within the Trump administration. I don't know whether Kellogg was kept completely out of the loop, though I'm going to say that I guess he was, or whether he was being kept informed in some way. I don't know whether there was deliberate misdirection of the Europeans and perhaps to some extent of the Russians, whether perhaps Trump and his people initially gave Kellogg freedom to try with the Russians and to see what he would come up with, and became increasingly impatient as Kellogg, instead of talking to the Russians, which is what he needed to do, was wasting time in Europe, taking an extraordinary amount of time to come up with his plan, wasting time doing so, wasting time, in my opinion, talking to the Europeans, whether what happened was that Trump and his people finally lost patience and decided that they needed to take the initiative themselves, or whether there was a deliberate game of misdirection, whether Kellogg was sent to Europe, encouraged to talk to the British and to the officials in Brussels and to the Europeans and perhaps to the Ukrainians, to keep them all reassured, to prevent them coming together and taking steps that might have made any approach to the Russians more difficult. Whether, in other words, this was a case of Trump losing patience with Kellogg, or Trump using Kellogg to keep the Europeans quiet whilst he began his dealings with the Russians. I don't know. But by the way, if it was misdirection, and I want to say this, it would not be out of character with the way in which this administration has acted since it took office on the 20th of January. We have repeatedly seen how Trump and his team, notably Elon Musk, have been keeping their domestic adversaries in the Democratic Party, in the structures of the permanent government of the United States, continuously off balance by moving very rapidly in entirely unexpected directions, concealing until the very last moment what they were about to do, so as to move forward their agenda. And I am not sure, in fact, I think it's quite possible that that is what Trump and his people were doing with the Europeans, using Kellogg as well. But I don't know that, and it could be, as I said, that it was simply a case of the Trump people finally getting fed up with Kellogg, realizing that he was making no progress, that he was only causing the Russians to get angry and to harden their positions, and was exposing the lack of leverage in the sort of negotiation with the Russians that Kellogg appeared to have in mind. Whether that was what happened or whether it was misdirection, I don't know. But anyway, for the record, I think there was an element of misdirection, but that's just my guess. Anyway, one way or the other, even as Kellogg was wandering around Europe, someone else was going to Moscow and doing what Kellogg ought to have done in the days after the inauguration, which is talk to the Russians. And that person was Steve Whiteoff, Donald Trump's friend, the real estate tycoon, the man who got the ceasefire in Gaza set up, the man who apparently is also going to be Trump's point man in dealing with Iran. Anyway, here I am going to admit an error on my part. A couple of days ago, I remember reading on TASS that Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, was being asked questions about Whiteoff about whether Whiteoff was indeed coming to Moscow and what he was going to be doing there. And Peskov was brushing aside all of those questions. And I thought that this was all bizarre and most unlikely. I couldn't imagine that Whiteoff at that time had any role to play in the Ukraine discussions. And I said as much in a program, and how completely wrong I was. Because Whiteoff went to Moscow, he spoke to the Russians. It would be interesting to know, by the way, which Russians, who exactly it was that he met whilst he was in Moscow. But it is clear that he broke the logjam. And he came back from Moscow with Mark Fogel, the teacher, who of course the Russians say is a spy. And we saw Fogel meet Trump. And Fogel was there with the American flag draped over his shoulders. And that was the meeting in which both Fogel and Trump spoke about how well treated Fogel had been by the Russians, and the meeting in which Trump said that the Russians had been treating the United States nicely. I discussed that in my program yesterday, but I was not aware when I made my program that it was Steve Whiteoff who was actually behind all of those moves. And then, clearly, as a result of Whiteoff's steps, whatever steps it was that he took in Moscow, the telephone call between Putin and Trump took place. And this telephone call has shaken the world. It has had an effect which it would be difficult to overstate its importance. But anyway, let's now turn to the call. Both the Russians and the Americans have provided us with accounts, and almost uniquely, by the way, the accounts almost exactly match. If you look at the Kremlin readout and what Trump has written about the call on Truth Social, you will find that the two accounts correspond exactly. Now that, by the way, is extremely unusual. It's very often the case in conversations between American and Russian officials, and by the way, Chinese and American officials. I read the readouts that the Russians and the Chinese publish, and then I read the American readouts, and they are totally different. In fact, sometimes you wonder whether they could be talking about the same conversation. Well, yesterday it was different. The Russian readout and Trump's account of the call correspond exactly. Now, let's first go to the Kremlin readout. And I say that because the Kremlin does always provide very detailed and comprehensive readouts, more so than the Americans do, though not in this case. And they're very informative in themselves because of the choice, the very careful choice of language that the Russians use when drafting their readouts. So this is what the Russian readout says. Telephone conversation with US President Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with President of the United States of America, Donald Trump. Now, already there is information here which goes beyond the fact that a conversation took place. Nowhere in this readout does it say who initiated the call, whether it was the Americans or the Russians. Now, that is important because when a readout, especially a Russian readout, by the way, specifies that it was the other side that initiated the call, that has sometimes about it just the hint of, well, almost discourtesy. It implies that the other side has acted as a kind of supplicant, that they have asked for the call and the Russians have condescended to agree to it. This time, the Russians are careful to say no such thing. I believe that it was the Americans who initiated the discussions. After all, it was Whiteoff who went to Moscow. But the Kremlin is not saying, and that, by the way, in the context of the very difficult relationship between the United States and Russia, and in light of previous Russian statements, that because it was American actions that had brought the relationship between the United States and Russia to the point of crisis, that it was the responsibility of the Americans to make the first move. The fact that the Kremlin is not hinting in any way that it was the Americans who initiated the discussions, which led to the call between Trump and Putin, that is an act of respect and courtesy towards Donald Trump. I say that, I hope I've explained why. It's not something that should be overlooked. Perhaps the people in Washington, the Trump people, will see it. Anyway, the discussion took place at 2000 hours Moscow time, so quite late in the evening. And this is what the Kremlin readout says. The leaders discussed issues related to the prisoner exchange between Russia and the United States. And in fact, after the release of Mark Fogel, the United States has released a Russian who was involved in some kind of cryptocurrency activity. I'm not going to waste time debating it. By the way, for the record, the Russians are hinting that both of these people, Fogel and this Russian, were involved in intelligence activities for their respective governments. That may or may not be true. I'm not going to waste time debating it either. Anyway, the leaders discuss issues related to the prisoner exchange between Russia and the United States. The US president assured the president of Russia of the American side's commitment to fulfill all the agreements reached. Now, these were agreements about the prisoner exchange, but again, one would assume that that was true. The Russians have released Fogel. The Americans had committed themselves in return to release one of Russia's people. It would be very surprising, it would be extraordinary if the Americans, after Fogel was released, went back on that. But that sentence takes us back to the discussion in Naked Capitalism by Eve Smith, which I discussed yesterday. Eve Smith spoke about the extreme levels of distrust which exist now between the United States and Russia, about which the Russians have spoken many times. So this sentence, which says that the president, the US president, assured the president of Russia of the American side's commitment to fulfill all the agreements reached, should be read as a statement by the Russians that they trust Donald Trump. Just saying. Donald Trump made a commitment to Putin, and the Russians accepted his word, and in fact, the agreement was honored. So, again, it doesn't seem to be an important sentence, but if you know anything about Russian readouts and how carefully worded they are, you will see that it is. Anyway, we now get to the substance. The leaders also discussed a possible Ukraine settlement. Now, Here, it's important to point out that there is the word possible. The Russians are not saying that there is going to be a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. They're only saying that there might be. Donald Trump spoke in favor of stopping the hostilities as soon as possible and solving the crisis peacefully, which is, of course, Donald Trump's well-known position. And then we come to the Russians. In turn, Vladimir Putin pointed out it was necessary to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and agreed with Donald Trump in that a sustainable settlement could only be reached via peaceful negotiations. Now, that is a very, very interesting statement. Firstly, we come back to the point about the fact that if there is going to be a settlement, it must address and eliminate the root causes of the conflict. Now, that tells us that Putin made no concessions at all over the course of this discussion. His position continues to be the one that he outlined in June 2024 when he addressed the foreign ministry. He set out what the conditions for peace are, which are based on the objectives that he set out in February for the special military operation. Ukraine, neutral status for Ukraine. Ukraine must never join NATO. Demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine must never be a threat to Russia. Denuclearization of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have been talking an awful lot about nuclear weapons recently. The complete elimination of the noxious ideology of the 1930s in Ukraine and the elimination of the political influence within Ukraine of the people who hold to this ideology. Full restoration of rights to Russian speakers and, well, now we know the Orthodox Church as well. And as far as the Russians are concerned, obviously, control for the Russians of the 4 regions which are part of Russia. The Russians have repeatedly said that they started the special military operation because they construed a threat to themselves coming from Ukraine. Not just from Ukraine, but from the role that NATO was assuming in Ukraine. NATO's attempts to establish itself in Ukraine, the kind of people it was supporting in Ukraine, the sort of action that those people who NATO was supporting in Ukraine were taking in Donbass, potentially against Crimea, in terms of developing nuclear weapons, in terms of building up their armed forces, all of those things, turning Ukraine, as the Russians sometimes say, into a kind of anti-Russia. Putin says that all of that must be addressed and eliminated. The root causes of the conflict must be solved and sorted out, and he's not prepared to move from that and to make any concessions on this issue at all. Now, this is important because, again, yesterday I received a lengthy message from a source who has information coming from Moscow. And this person has provided me with details of some of the ideas which I presume Kellogg has been sending to the Russians in terms of what a potential settlement might look like. And it bears no relation to any of this, any of the things that the Russians are concerned about. Not only would there be a freeze of the conflict, but all of the major concessions would have to be made by the Russians from that point onward. up to and including apparently significant withdrawals of the Russians from territory that they control in Ukraine, with Ukraine having half of Zaporozhye region returned to it. Something which, of course, the Russians would reject completely. So Putin made it clear to Trump that to the extent that these ideas are still floating around, he is not interested in them. The Russians won't agree to them. To repeat again, point I have made many times, the Russians are winning the war. They undoubtedly calculate that they can withstand any further sanctions pressure. They undoubtedly calculate that they can survive an all-out economic war, whereas Donald Trump politically might struggle to do so, given the effect an economic war like that would have on the global economy. So the Russians feel themselves to be in the driving seat, and they have no need to make concessions. At the same time, and it's also a point I have made before, Russian demands are centered on Ukraine and on Russian security interests. They do not undermine the core interests of the United States. They have been carefully calibrated not to do so. They do not demand, for example, that the United States withdraw completely from Europe or close NATO down or anything like that. The Russian demands are limited. They're limited to providing security for Russia on its western borders, but they don't go beyond that. And the Russians are not prepared to compromise on them. So Putin took a strong line there, but he also agreed with Donald Trump in that a sustainable settlement could only be reached via peaceful negotiations. So Putin is saying, by all means, let's talk. Let's talk. We are not going to look to impose solutions. We would prefer to agree them with you, if that is possible. And a sustainable settlement is what the Russians are looking for, not a freeze, nothing of that kind. The Russians are not going to agree to that. But they do want a long-term, sustainable settlement with the United States that will secure Russia's interests and the security of its western borders. This is what, for the Russians, this has always been about. They don't want to be put in a position where they occupy the whole of Ukraine, that they have to keep huge armies permanently on station along NATO's eastern borders, where they find themselves in an endless, protracted confrontation with the United States and the Western powers, because that is not in Russia's interest. It diverts energy and time and resources away from the Russians' priority, which is to develop their own society and economy and to address the many pressing domestic problems that they have. The Russians have always said this, and here we see Putin making that point again in this discussion he had with Donald Trump. And I have said previously, and I said at length in my program yesterday, that the Americans also have a matching interest here, because if they do want to draw down their forces in Europe so that they can focus on the supposed challenge from China in the Asia-Pacific region, they too need a stable situation in Europe, and the way to achieve that in a sustainable way, is through an agreement with Russia. I discussed this all at length in my program yesterday. So that was what they said about Ukraine. It was only one part of the discussion, because we then learn that this discussion that went on for 90 minutes covered many other topics as well. Additionally, the president of Russia expressed support for one of the US president's key arguments, which was that it was time for both countries to work together. The issues of Middle East settlement, Iran's nuclear program, and bilateral economic relations between Russia and the United States were also brought up during the conversation. I've said this in many programs, that beyond the question of Ukraine, given that both the United States and Russia are great powers, it is absolutely in the interests of both that they have an active and continuous dialogue with each other in order to address issues of mutual interest. And I have also said that even if there are obstacles in the way of achieving a peace in Ukraine, and those obstacles remain, and they are extremely great, and it might prove impossible, by the way, to overcome them. We'll say more about that later. That dialogue between the Americans and the Russians needs to continue, because there are so many other topics that they need to discuss with each other. And here the Russians have listed some of them. The issues of Middle East settlement. In other words, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Iran's nuclear program. Now, in various recent programs, both on this channel and in another program Alex Christoforou and I did on the Duran, we discussed, and I said, that given that the Russians have just signed a partnership agreement with Iran, which takes the form of a treaty, and that as part of that treaty, Iran has made treaty commitments to Russia not to pursue a nuclear program, a nuclear weapons program. The Russians are in a strong position as the party in place in Iran and the one which has security agreements with Iran to be able to tell the United States, to tell Donald Trump and the Trump administration that they can ensure that Iran does not move forward with a nuclear weapons program. Iran has said that it doesn't want to, and the Russians are now in a position to confirm it. There was some skepticism, some entirely understandable skepticism in several places, by the way, about whether the Russians and the Americans would indeed talk about Iran and its actual or notional nuclear weapons program. I always thought that they would, and here you see the Kremlin readout confirming that they have in fact actually done so. And bilateral economic relations between Russia and the United States were also brought up during the conversation. And here, by the way, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has provided us with some degree of gloss, because he has gone beyond the readout itself in explaining what these last words mean. So there was no discussion of sanctions, either of extending sanctions or of lifting them. The whole Kellogg approach of offering the Russian sanctions relief and threatening them with all-out economic war, all of that was dropped. Trump didn't go there. The Russians don't, as it happens, like to talk about sanctions with third countries. Olaf Scholz complained to Emmanuel Macron at one point that the Russians don't like talking about sanctions when discussing Ukraine-related issues with Germany. And Scholz was surprised and rather baffled and concerned about it. But of course, it's an understandable position if you look at things from the Russian point of view. They've always said that they consider sanctions illegal and wrong. They're not going to discuss sanctions, therefore, because on principle they should be lifted. They're not afraid of the sanctions and recent economic news. The fact that for 2 years running they've achieved GDP growth above 4% means they don't need to be, or they don't need to feel afraid of the sanctions. So they were not looking to discuss the sanctions with Donald Trump, and they will have appreciated the fact that Donald Trump didn't bring up the question of the sanctions. I don't know who advised Trump about that, but whoever did, perhaps it was his own decision, was wise in that respect. But on economic questions, Peskov says that they discussed energy, that they discussed oil issues. As we shall see, Trump talks about that in his own comments on Truth Social. And that takes us back to what Putin said to Pavel Zarubin about 2 weeks ago now, which is that Russia and the United States, in some respects, have some things in common. Both are vast, mostly self-sufficient countries. Both have significant manufacturing bases, which each wants to expand. Both, at the same time, are major energy producers and exporters. Both, therefore, have a common interest in having energy prices set at a level which will not put pressure on their domestic economies, on their domestic manufacturing economies by being too high, but which will be high enough to make the development of the energy sector of both economies worthwhile. So Putin said that. Trump perhaps heard him, and, well, it looks as if they had a discussion about that too. And of course, I have made the point in several programs that if Donald Trump wants to reduce domestic inflation, given that increasing oil and gas production in the United States is going to take time, and given that Saudi Arabia and OPEC are in no real position, for many reasons, to flood the world with cheap oil, the way in which he can reduce prices most quickly is by lifting or relaxing the sanctions on Russian energy exports, allowing oil prices to reach their natural level, which in present conditions would be downwards. So they appear to have had a discussion about this. Now, in order to anticipate further, I should say that Trump and Putin, as we shall see in a moment, agreed that there would be a summit between them. And apparently they have agreed that that summit meeting will happen in Saudi Arabia. And MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, has apparently already been for some time involved in all of these discussions and is busy preparing, making preparations for Saudi Arabia to host the summit. I have said in previous programs that because in part of the ICC warrant on Putin and all of the other attendant problems, it was unlikely that the summit meeting between Putin and Trump would take place in Europe. I suggested that one of the Gulf monarchies, perhaps Qatar or the UAE or Saudi Arabia, might provide the venue, and sure enough, it is Saudi Arabia. There are important geopolitical implications in this, but consider Putin and Trump are discussing energy-related issues. They are both leaders of major energy exporters. Both the United States and Russia are energy exporters. Both export liquefied natural gas and oil products. They're going to meet in Saudi Arabia, and which is, of course, the other big country that exports oil and plays a major role in determining the price. Why, of course, Saudi Arabia? I fully expect MBS and his oil minister to be participating at some point in those discussions. So there we go. Then we go on to read, the president of Russia invited the US president to visit Moscow and expressed willingness to receive visiting officials from the United States to discuss topics of mutual interest, including a possible Ukraine settlement. So, Putin said to Trump, by all means, if you want to begin negotiations, we are absolutely welcome for that. If you want to send your people to Moscow, we will engage with them, and we will engage with them seriously on all topics, including the topic of Ukraine. And as we will see shortly, Trump has already largely set up his negotiating team. And a short while ago, Peskov, on behalf of the Kremlin, said that the Russians are setting up their negotiating team also. So already we see that the framework for future contacts is being put in place. But of course, it goes beyond that, because each of these leaders has now apparently confirmed a willingness to visit respective countries. Trump will visit Russia, and apparently that will be the first of these visits. And Putin will be visiting the United States. Now, that is a massive change in international relations. Because, of course, when leaders visit other countries, they come as guests. The presence of a leader in a country suggests a significant warming of relations. It also suggests a good personal relationship between the visiting leader and the leader who acts as host. Now, we've spent many years now going far beyond the era of the special military operation, in which US officials, US media, Western officials have been speaking about Putin in the most incredible terms, in which he's been presented to the world as Lucifer's representative on earth and that sort of thing. And now he's not only going to meet Donald Trump, but he is going to be hosting Donald Trump in Moscow and visiting the United States as well. So this represents a massive change. And I'm going to say also that it's going to be very difficult to sustain the sanctions pressure if these reciprocal visits do take place. I'm not saying it's impossible. Sanctions can be in force and visitors can meet and visit each other's countries. But nothing like this has happened since 2014 when the Ukraine crisis first got underway. So this is a breakthrough. And the Russian readout then ends. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump agreed to maintain personal contact in the future, involving in particular in-person meetings. And Trump has been talking significantly about this, and so has Peskov, by the way. And they both say that steps to organize the first summit meeting between the two, between Putin and Trump, are now busily underway, and that meeting is expected to take place very soon, perhaps next week. And as I said, it will happen in Saudi Arabia. And I fully expect MBS himself to be involved. So this is what the Russians said about this call. As I said, it is enormously interesting and very important, and it does represent a massive shift in the international atmosphere. But before analysing all this further, I think it is equally important to look at what the Americans, and specifically Donald Trump, have been saying. Now, Donald Trump has provided his own account of the call on Truth Social, and as I said, most unusually, it almost exactly matches. In fact, it exactly matches the Russian readout. Obviously, there are differences in emphasis, and as we shall see, in language. But when you look at the substance, the concrete points, they are the same. So this is what Donald Trump said. I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. In fact, we know the call lasted 90 minutes, which is a long call. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. So the Russian readout says that they talked about Ukraine, but other things, the Middle East, energy. Well, it wasn't the Russian readout that said that they talked about energy, but Peskov has said that. And, of course, Donald Trump here is confirming it. They also talked about artificial intelligence. Well, the Russian readout doesn't talk about that, but I've no doubt that they did. And the power of the dollar. Now, the Americans have been very worried about some of the debates that have been taking place within the BRICS about creating a new financial and trade system. Now, the BRICS countries have, however, repeatedly said that they have no plan to set up an alternative reserve currency to the dollar. And I've discussed this at length in many earlier programs. I discussed it directly after the Kazan BRICS summit meeting. For the moment, doing that would present far too many difficulties. And for the record, Putin has repeatedly said that Russia didn't choose to stop using the dollar. It was driven out of the dollar by the sanctions policy of the United States. So Trump and his people, Marco Rubio, by the way, has recently made some really rather alarmed comments about how if trends continue and if countries continue to de-dollarize at the rate that they are doing, within 5 years, enforcing sanctions, he means, of course, US sanctions, will become impossible. Trump, for his part, has been very, very concerned to secure the international position of the dollar. And on this, Putin could actually give him some reassurance. He can tell him, well, look, we are going to set up this financial and trade system. We can hardly do otherwise, given the sanctions attack that has been forced upon us. We did not choose to go down this road. Your predecessors forced us to. But ultimately, we are not seeking to dethrone the dollar from its position as the world's reserve currency, at least not for the time being. And I am sure that, Trump will have heard that, and they will no doubt have had a further discussion. It's not just that Trump will be anxious that if the dollar loses reserve currency status, sanctions become unenforceable. I suspect of even greater concern to him will be the worry that if the dollar were to lose reserve currency status, it would be impossible for the United States to finance its enormous budget and trade deficits. And though he and Elon Musk seem to be determined to do something about those deficits, realistically, it's going to take time before that happens. So anyway, they will have had a discussion about that. And then Trump goes on to say this: we both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people and we likewise lost so many. Now that is a much, much better drafted comment than his previous comment about the World War II on Truth Social. I'm not going to repeat what I said about that. But the point is that the Russians will have liked this comment. This comment treats them as a great nation, a great country. It shows respect towards them, and the Russians will be appreciative of this. And then it goes on to say, we each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. So that offers the prospect of some sort of peace, some kind of, well, maybe no longer quite the adversarial relationship between Russia and the United States that we have seen. Well, that promise has been made many times in the past. It was made between Roosevelt and Stalin during the Second World War. It was made during the détente period. It was made again during the time of perestroika between Gorbachev and Reagan. It was never quite happened, but one can always perhaps wish and hope. And then Trump goes on to say, but first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of common sense. Clever of Putin to do that, by the way. As my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou said, Putin knows how to speak to Donald Trump. He does it much better than America's erstwhile European allies do. We agreed to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We also agreed to have our respective teams start negotiations immediately, and he means of course the United States, will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. Now notice the choice of words, to inform him of the conversation. Zelensky, of course, was not party to the call between Trump and Putin. He's not yet had a meeting with Trump since Trump was inaugurated. He did not discuss the call with Putin with Trump in advance. He has been presented by Trump with a fait accompli, and Trump, out of the goodness of his heart, through a tremendous exercise of goodwill, I'm being, of course, sarcastic, is going to inform Zelensky of what was said. We're going to come to that in a moment, because Trump has, in fact, provided an account on Truth Social of his conversation with Zelensky as well. And then Trump goes on to say, I've asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. The name that is absent from that list, the person who is not mentioned on this post on Truth Social as part of the negotiating team, the American negotiating team, is Keith Kellogg. It is quite interesting. Witkoff is there, but not Kellogg. Now, shortly after, the White House spokesman said that Kellogg remains peace envoy. He is still hugely respected. He is absolutely a part of the team. Perhaps he is. Perhaps he still has a role to play. But clearly, he's not at the top of Donald Trump's mind, because when Trump set up his negotiating team, he somehow managed to forget Kellogg. So Kellogg is not there. I can't help but think, and I'm sure that anybody reading this will agree, that the fact that Kellogg's name is not there is a sign that Trump is not impressed with what he's achieved so far. That his attempts to bully and bribe the Russians into concessions, which the Russians were never going to make. What yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said were outrageous statements and impossible demands. Well, that has been dropped, and maybe Kellogg has not yet formally been dropped. But I can't help but think that for the moment at least, the president has lost some of his confidence in him, and he is on his way out. I think that is an entirely good thing, by the way, because as far as I'm concerned, Kellogg was clearly out of his depth in these negotiations. And then Trump finishes. Millions of people have died in a war that would not have happened if I were president. Well, now it's millions of people. Maybe it is. Who knows? But it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call, and for the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort would lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. Well, whether it will be soon remains to be seen, but we are going to get a summit meeting, probably next week, possibly next week. I'm not going to say probably, possibly next week in Saudi Arabia. As I said, MBS will be there, and well, we will see what comes out of that meeting. Most probably, and people should expect this, there will be lots of bumps along the way. But anyway, this has happened, and it is a breakthrough. The presidents of America and Russia are talking together. They're talking to each other in a friendly way. They are looking for ways forward on Ukraine, and they are discussing the entire relationship with each other. Now, Trump, as he said, did speak also to Zelensky, and I will say what he said to Zelensky. I just spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine. The conversation went very well. He, like President Putin, wants to make peace. We discussed a variety of topics having to do with the war, but mostly the meeting that is being set up on Friday in Munich, where Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio will lead the delegation. I'm hopeful that the results of that meeting will be positive. It is time to stop this ridiculous war where there has been massive and totally unnecessary death and destruction. God bless the people of Russia and Ukraine. Now, The conversation between Putin and Trump lasted for 90 minutes. I saw a report somewhere that the conversation between Zelensky and Trump lasted for 10 minutes. I cannot confirm that. But this very cursory statement on Truth Social is consistent with that. I suspect that it was a short call. My guess is that Trump telephoned Zelensky, told Zelensky, I've spoken to Putin, we're going to move forward towards peace, and Vance and Rubio are going to fill you in on all the details. Notice, again, that there is no reference here to Kellogg, a further sign that Kellogg is no longer the point man in questions concerning Ukraine. Now, I have to say, and perhaps this is unintentional, but to me, this rather looks like Vance and Rubio coming to meet Zelensky in order to make sure that he gets the message. And the message is very clear. Project Ukraine is over. The United States has had enough. The war didn't work. The Russians weren't defeated. The Russian economy didn't collapse. There wasn't regime change in Moscow. The sums of money the United States has given to Ukraine, which Trump is now saying came to $350 billion, looks like money thrown away to no useful purpose. The US Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bassent, is currently in Kiev, apparently demanding to see the books and talking about Ukraine, agreeing to some kind of economic deal with the United States, which is clearly intended to compensate the United States in some way for all this money that's been lost. Anyway, Vance and Rubio look like they're going to come and speak to Zelensky and make everything clear to him and make sure that he understands that Project Ukraine is done. Now, that is the conversation between Putin and Trump and the follow-up conversation between Trump and Zelensky. Now, alongside this conversation, there was a speech at what was supposed to be a meeting in Europe of European countries and the Americans, chaired by the British Defence Secretary, John Healey, in order to agree further support for Ukraine. Now, I have not got a complete record of Pete Hegseth's comments, but they seem to have been every bit as dramatic as Trump's discussions with Putin, and they chime exactly with them. So, what did Pete Hegseth say? First of all, he said that the United States does not expect Ukraine to join NATO as a result of any negotiations. It looks as if the whole project of bringing Ukraine into NATO is over, at least as far as this administration is concerned. That is one. Pete Hegseth also, from what I understand, said that American funding and support for Ukraine is basically over. I don't think he said that funding would completely stop, but following on from what Trump has been saying and Musk has been saying, the United States has already given huge amounts of money to Ukraine and to support Ukraine. And this can't continue anymore. If the Europeans want to do it, well, then it is up to them. But the United States has done what it can. The United States is not going to send troops to Ukraine under any circumstances, be there war or peace there. Ukraine is not going to succeed in recovering its lost territories. It's not going to get back to the 2014 borders. One European official, and apparently all the European officials, were in a state of shock after Hegseth's words. One European official tried to spin the best that he could from it. He told the Financial Times, well, it's bad enough that Hegseth was talking about the 2014 borders, but at least he wasn't talking about the 2022 borders, clinging to the illusion that the Russians can be persuaded to retreat back to the original start lines of February 2022, from the time when the special military operation was launched. That is desperate. There is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to be persuaded to retreat back to their February 2022 positions. That is a pipe dream. And the fact that a European official spoke in that way showed how shell-shocked and stunned the Europeans are. So that was another thing that Pete Hegseth said. Then he said that the United States is not going to give guarantees for any European troops who go to Ukraine. And from what I can understand, he basically ruled out security guarantees from the United States to Ukraine, either Article 5 type guarantees or their equivalent or anything like that. Now that, to my mind, and here Anatol Lieven has written a piece on responsible statecraft, that basically kills the whole idea of a European peacekeeping force deployed to Ukraine. Hegseth said, if the Europeans want to do that, that is up to them. It doesn't concern the United States, however. The United States is not going to be involved, and it is not going to provide any guarantees to enable it to happen. The Europeans have made it clear that they're not prepared to send troops to Ukraine without American guarantees. The Russians have made clear their strong opposition to any kind of deployments. I think this idea is, to all intents and purposes, dead. Anatol Lieven says so, and I agree with him. So, the Americans also, according to Hegseth, are going to reduce their military positions in Europe. They're going to focus on the Asia-Pacific instead, where China is becoming increasingly strong. That is now the priority for the United States. Apparently Hegseth used that word. Europe is no longer the priority. That, again, was something the Europeans were absolutely shocked to hear. It was their worst nightmare, well, their second worst nightmare, as we will discuss shortly. But there it is. That's what the Americans are saying. They're pulling out of Europe. They're pulling out of the conflict in Ukraine. They're going to try and seek a peace agreement with the Russians in Ukraine. But their belief in this war has gone. They're no longer seeking to achieve any kind of victory over the Russians. They do have a shared interest with the Russians, I discussed it yesterday, in coming to some kind of settlement that will stabilize the situation in Europe. They're perhaps not so bothered about the details. And if they can't get it, well, they will walk away, and it will be left to the Europeans and the Ukrainians by themselves to pull the coals out of the fire and to see what they can do. Project Ukraine is over, at least as far as this administration is concerned. Now, let me stress this does not mean that the conflict in Ukraine is over. The Americans may be losing interest in it. They may be signaling that they're going to resume their contacts with the Russians. But of course, there is a Ukrainian dimension to this conflict, and there is a European dimension to this conflict. And that, no doubt, will continue, at least for the time being. There is no ceasefire. In the hours after the Trump-Putin call, the British media were talking about Trump and Putin working towards agreeing a ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine. Nowhere, not in the Kremlin readout, nor in Trump's messages on Truth Social, does the word ceasefire anywhere appear. On the contrary, if you go back to what the Russians have said, they're talking about a sustainable settlement, which is, of course, what they have always said. They reject ceasefires, they reject freezes. They've been there, they've done that. They seem that it only ends up in the Ukrainians rearming and going back on whatever commitments they've made and starting the fighting all over again. And the Russians are not going to go there again. So, no ceasefire, no freeze, a sustainable settlement. That is what the Americans are going for. But if, to repeat again, the Americans can't achieve it, which of course they would rather that they did, and which the Russians would also rather that they did, for the reasons I discussed in my program yesterday. Well, the Americans are now signaling that they're going to walk away. They're not going to keep their troops in Europe. They're not going to give Ukraine security guarantees. They're not going to give the Europeans security guarantees either. Europe will, of course, remain part of NATO. It will continue to be protected under the US nuclear umbrella. But the Americans will pull out. But at that point, if there is no agreement, the Europeans and the Ukrainians can go on fighting as they wish. And by the way, if they win or if they lose, it will be up to them. And of course, if there is a peace, then it will be the Europeans who will have to pay the cost of Ukraine's reconstruction, which Bloomberg, by the way, is guesstimating at over $3 trillion. Just saying. So the Europeans are in absolute shock. They became part of a joint enterprise, Project Ukraine. This had all been sealed and agreed at the time of the February 2022 Munich Security Conference, as I well remember. And the dominant partner, the senior partner in that enterprise, the United States, has said enough. The Europeans are stunned, and they issued an extraordinarily bitter statement. And this was said by their foreign ministers. We are ready, 6 foreign ministers, France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and the United Kingdom. We are ready to enhance our support for Ukraine. We commit to its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's war of aggression. Nowhere in any of these American comments is there any reference to an war of aggression by Russia. We share the goal to keep supporting Ukraine until a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace is achieved, a peace that guarantees the interest of Ukraine and our own. We look forward to discussing the way ahead together with our American allies. Our shared objective should be to put Ukraine in a position of strength. Ukraine and Europe should be part of any negotiations, Ukraine should be provided with strong security guarantees. It's effectively a rebuke to the Americans, but it is a pathetic one because everybody knows that the Europeans by themselves have no means to continue with this enterprise. They've rushed this statement out and it means nothing. Now, there's been a withering comment about this statement from the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán. This declaration is a sad testament of bad Brusselian leadership. While President Donald Trump and President Putin negotiate on peace, EU officials issue worthless statements. You can't request a seat at the negotiating table. You have to earn it through strength, good leadership, and smart diplomacy. The position of Brussels to support killing as long as it takes is morally and politically unacceptable. It's not just morally and politically unacceptable, it is bankrupt. The great nightmare for the European leaders, for the Ukrainians, is that the Americans and the Russians would eventually come together and come to a settlement with each other. For the Europeans, that is an even more nightmarish outcome than an outright Russian military victory, which leaves the Russians in full control of the entire territory of Ukraine. At least that outcome would probably ensure the indefinite presence of the Americans in Europe, which is what the Europeans want to see. Instead, the Americans and the Russians are coming together. They're talking about a settlement with each other, a settlement which, given that the Russians are winning the war, is all but certain to be a settlement on Russian terms. And of course, if that settlement nonetheless isn't achieved because of obstruction from Kiev and obstruction from Europe, all that's going to happen is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are going to be left carrying the burden, facing that defeat by themselves. And coming back to an earlier point that I made earlier in this program, to add poison to this drink, this bitter drink, that they are also going to have to drink. The first meeting between Putin and Trump, where vital issues to determine the security of Europe is going to take place, is not even going to happen in Europe. All previous meetings between the Russian and American leaders, going all the way back to the first meetings between Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill in Yalta and Potsdam, all of the meetings since then have either happened in Europe or they've happened in Russia and the United States. This time, for the first time since the three-power meeting in 1943 in Tehran, where, of course, the British were represented by their Prime Minister Winston Churchill, this time the meeting is going to take place in Saudi Arabia, not even in Europe. And it looks as if the Europeans and the Ukrainians are not going to be there. They insist upon their right to participate in the negotiations. But as Orbán says, how have they earned that right? They've never engaged in constructive diplomacy of their own. They've spent all the time over the last 3 years abusing and criticizing and sanctioning the Russians and making impossible promises to the Ukrainians, even as a deepening economic crisis afflicts Europe, even as energy prices soar and budget problems mount. And now, of course, they find themselves facing complete exclusion from the negotiations. And the same equally applies to Ukraine. All the promises made by the Biden people, nothing without Ukraine, discussions only with Ukraine, all of that has come to nothing. And again, the Ukrainians have themselves ultimately to blame for this. Whatever pressure was placed on them, it was they who chose to walk away from the Istanbul Agreement they had in April 2022. They passed the ridiculous decree of 2nd October 2022, forbidding negotiations with the Russians entirely. They came up with Zelensky's ridiculous peace plan, whereby the Russians must withdraw completely from all territory previously controlled by Ukraine after 1991, and then agreed to war crimes tribunals and reparations and all of that kind of thing. The Ukrainians have also disastrously and catastrophically overplayed their hand, as the Europeans have done. We already have the predictable complaints. Gabrielius Landsbergis, the former Lithuanian foreign minister, is talking about how this is the second Munich, the first Munich being, of course, the one that was agreed by Chamberlain and the German leaders in 1938. Absurd idea. Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister, also furious about this, saying, how dare the Americans make concessions to the Russians before negotiations even begin. Boris Pistorius, the hardline German defense minister, is saying the same. In fact, all of them collectively are paying the price, exactly as Orban says, for the fact that they never engaged in any rational decision-making or proper diplomacy over the last 3 years. They acted as if they were at war with Russia without actually being so. And now that they are facing defeat, they are going to pay the price. Now, to repeat again, this is not the end of the Ukrainian conflict. In fact, it is highly likely that the conflict will drag on, at least for a while. Zelensky is now busy arresting or intimidating his opponents in Kiev, even as no doubt he feels that his own time, is running out. We don't know what the hardline nationalists will do in Ukraine. We don't know what will happen in the negotiations between the Russians and the Americans. But one way or the other, time has been called on Project Ukraine. The Americans are walking away from it, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians have been left out in the cold where they deserve to be. Well, that's my program for today. There'll be much more to discuss tomorrow, no doubt, including an astonishing conversation between Putin and the new leader of Syria, President al-Shara, which also took place yesterday. But that for tomorrow. In the meantime, let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. And of course, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.